like Marco Polo. And people who came along the Silk Road seem to have been telling these tales. So, in the way that we are in the West with our histories of Monte Carlo and Las Vegas, probably one of the first things to spread were playing cards. And you start to get printed playing cards of one form or another in the West before Gutenberg. Was there a link? Well, one possible link is thought to be the chap who I mentioned briefly, Nicholas of Cusa. He was the archbishop. We've met him already once before. He was kind of the religious patron of Gutenberg. And some feel that it was he that got Gutenberg probably into printing, probably indulgences, and very likely the Bible. And it may be that he kind of persuaded the parishes of North Germany that they should all get this new kind of Bible, and therefore gave Gutenberg and Fust a natural outlet for this prototype technology which they thought people wouldn't understand. So he may have been very instrumental in getting that business going, but it's also, some people suggest, important to know that he, in fact, was a papal envoy to what we now call the Middle East, particularly to areas of what we think of as Turkey and Syria. And it's quite possible that that's the end of the Silk Road, where people coming back from China and goods coming back from China and things like playing cards were coming. It's quite possible that he was there and saw this stuff and thought, that's pretty interesting. And I know an agile metalsmith in Germany who may be able to put this into effect. So there is the possibility that these two are connected. There is the possibility that these two are interestingly simultaneous. But the big question then is, what are the effects of the technology? If we look at where printing spread, well, we can say China 7th century, Korea 8th century, Japan 8th century, and spreads and develops and they get the metal type, etc. Western Europe then looks pretty laggard coming in at the 15th century and no longer on the cutting edge. And if that's the case, then it asks you a bit about the grand Facebook claim, which of course isn't only the Facebook claim, but everybody's. Here's this technology that when you have it, it changes society. And we can even say what the changes look like. Well, it produces democratic government, a stable constitution, as stable written constitution, as Vigesimus Nox said. Then it gives us reformation, it changes our religion. Well, can we say that it did that in China? Anyone say that that's an account of Chinese history? Doesn't really look as though these arguments that this technology has these determined effects really holds up when we start to look elsewhere. I was once at a conference with Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's an extremely nice woman, but also with a series of scholars from Japan and Korea and China. And it was kind of awkward occasion, because every time she said, but in Europe we did this. Oh yeah, we did that 200 years earlier. And if we look again, we might remember two other lists that we had that were sort of like this. And so we have printing, and we have paper, and we have the codex. And we thought of paper as a kind of revolution, and we think of the codex as a revolution. But if we look at the dates when they spread, they're not really coherent revolutions. That is, Chartier, you remember, said the codex was really important. Well, the Europeans get the codex really early, but the Chinese can't be bothered about it. They, in fact, get it late and don't use it much. We look at societies getting paper early, like India, Islam, almost as soon as it came into being, but they leave print behind till very late. But it isn't possible to say that they were backward societies. They just developed in different ways. And in fact, some of them had, particularly Islam, had a kind of Plato-like suspicion of the printed book. And they would say, what we really want to know is who this text came from. It was transmission through generations, rather than printed books that they relied on to know the reliability of the text. And as we saw, when Jewish cultures looked at the codex, they said, we can't trust that stuff. We want to know whether this stuff is reliable, and this technology doesn't give us that opportunity. And indeed, there are interesting arguments made by Christopher Bailey about India, where he says, look, Indians had created a highly effective information order. They weren't a backward society. They just got by without print. And in fact, it was only at a certain point that they decided that they needed print. But all the political and cultural changes came first. And it's only later that they say, well, yeah, print will be something to add on this. So the idea that you get print and then all these changes occur, and sometimes with these other technologies, the paper, the codex, look the other way around and say, look, we'll have those changes, and then these things will come in. So when we look elsewhere, the story that we like to tell about this technology should make us a little cautious about these easy claims of revolution. Though clearly the printing press is an important technology. So one thing, say, well, why has some of this been missed? So just a few minutes on, what else was going on that somehow was missed? Well, one, and this is where Adrienne Johns, in a way, comes up to argue against Elizabeth Eisenstein, is that she has this idea of this high scholarly printing press with these very reliable books that, unlike manuscripts, were unreliable, went out into the world and established new standards for reliability. And one of her arguments, which again is an important one, particularly about maps and images, is that if you're a scientist in London and I'm a scientist in Leiden, we can communicate ideas if I can say, look at the map that's in that book that you just received, or look at page 27 or whatever. And if those two are the same, we can have this long conversation back and forth by letter talking about the same thing. And Eisenstein makes that point, and it's an important point, but it has to come up against the fact that actually this is something of an idealization, and early printed books were often an enormous mess. John Evelyn, who we've met before in London, again says, look, you just can't trust these books. These great classic texts that we want to read are not put together by these high-minded printers like Aldous with Erasmus doing the proofreading. They're put together by hacks who simply want to make some money and sell. So the printed book was often thought of as wholly unreliable, rather than in this idealization as reliable. That Descartes looked around and he said, even if all the knowledge could be found in books, where it is mixed in with so many useless things and confusingly heaped, it would take longer to read these books than we have to live this life. So we just don't have time for all this stuff that the printing press is chucking out. It's making life more difficult, it's unreliable, and it's kind of swamping us with the good and the bad. So again, the simple idea that it leads to science. Not that it didn't, but there are clearly problems in there. And again, Adrienne Johns brings in the other, he looks at Shakespeare's First Folio, one of the most famous books in the West, and it was a very important printing endeavor. And he says, it boasted some 600 different typefaces, along with non-uniform spelling and punctuation, erratic divisions and arrangements, mispaging, irregular proofreading, and no two copies of this book are identical. There are changes between every version of the book. So again, our notions of standardization fall apart a bit. And again, there are questions of authenticity. Luther, who we know for his great spread of the text in the world, says, well, actually, Luther's first book was a pirated book. He didn't have control over it. He didn't know who wrote it, and it probably wasn't reliable. So again, piracy becomes an issue almost at the dawn of print, as Adrienne Johns would ask you. And that's a moment to remind you that on Thursday, Adrienne Johns will be speaking on campus. So again, this question of reliability and scholarly editing comes up against the problem. And in fact, Vigesimus Nox makes the same point. He says, look, you just can't trust these editions. They're so badly edited. You might as well go back to the original manuscript. So there's the problem that's emerging. Then we have the argument about science. So we get all these great science books coming out, and so science spreads. But the trouble with science was that it came up against an awful lot of pseudoscience. And we'll be talking about this on Thursday. But print was almost as much a problem for science as it was a solution. You could still write your handwritten letters from London to Germany, and you'd be pretty sure that the letter that left you would be the letter that arrived there. But if you pointed to a particular printed book, you couldn't be sure that the two looked the same. But not only that, you had all this other stuff that pretended to be science coming up in the interim and spreading around the world, and making exactly the same kind of grand claims, one of which we'll look at further in the future, is the Almanac. And the Almanac, which now you can hardly find copies of because they disappeared very quickly, but thousands and thousands and thousands, more than indulgences. So they had a huge audience. For 3.5 centuries, the Almanac had probably been the most popular book in the English language. And the Almanac had our horoscopes, and it had weird dates, and it had prognostications of ghosts and terrible movements in the stars. It told us that the world was going to end the next week, etc., etc. So what was spreading as much as this high-minded science was an extraordinary kind of debased nature of knowledge, what we need to know, what's important. And so while early on perhaps 600 different ones were published, Sinclair reckons that by the 18th century about 400,000 a year of these things were circulating. And so they produced a kind of popular science that was telling you what to take for certain illnesses and diseases. They seemed in some ways to be, in a world where medical knowledge, which again we'll discuss, was limited, reliable. But of course when you look at them now, you discover that they were nearly all sold or printed by the people who were selling and making the drugs at the same time. So they were purporting to be science, but in fact they were advertisements. So Google searches perhaps owe something to the world of the Almanac. So in a way what we've looked at is this grand claim that we can look at a particular technology and see coming from it some very distinctive effects. One is a change in the Renaissance. And as she said, that the Renaissance was underway already. One was Reformation, but as we've seen, religious texts were perhaps as much indulgences as they were Bibles or Luther-like attacks on the church, and science. And again, we've seen that science, we'll see yet more next week, was problematic. But most important of all, what we try to see is that if you take the same technology and look at how it developed elsewhere, you can't really trace any of these effects to it at all. And that must ask us to pause both in how we think about the printing press, but also in how we think about these claims about technology, because this, in a way, is the classic technology on which these claims are made. As I said at the beginning, people always look back and say, not since Gutenberg. Facebook, just like Gutenberg in the printing press. So when we see those claims about any technology, particularly if they're drawn from print, we want to say, well, what do we know about print? And what we know about print is not quite the standard story that's told all the time. One of the things then to bear in mind is that it's just a weird and pervasive human trait to try to say there's this one technology, and perhaps along with this one technology, there's this one person. And everything can be tied back to this great moment when someone comes along. And we saw it beginning with Socrates. So there's Tooth, because we need someone to say who invented writing. The notion Moses, perhaps, invented writing. The Lord Palubo we talked about invented paper. Now we know the Chinese probably had paper for 150 years before this guy came along, but somehow it's always been convenient to know there's one person that did it. And we'll see as we go forward these things happen, whether it's with Morse or with Edison or with Bell, that all these claims that there's a single person and a single technology, and from there we can trace everything else, whether they come right down to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, they're just pervasive. But be very cautious when you come upon them, because even the most concrete of them start to look a little woozy when we get close to them, particularly in our world, the world of the history of information. They are, in a way, a dime a dozen. Stick into the Google search box, change the world, and you will just get thousands of things that change the world. Apple changed the world, Newt Gingrich changed the world, Simon Cowell changed the world. Anybody can change the world, but we'll always tend to be seduced so very easily by those ideas. Be cautious, particularly when we're talking about the world around us today, because remember, we are the Platos of our time, looking at changes about us and trying to say what they've done, what they will do, and we might be as ill-informed as some of you thought poor Plato was. So what I tried to look at then is Eisenstein herself and her particular claims, try to look at this particular revolution, but also to ask the question, what does this tell us about revolutions in general and revolutionary claims, and therefore what should we be looking for? Well, what in fact did come before, not after? What went on elsewhere? What was necessary versus what was sufficient? And we'll come back to several of these issues, as I've suggested, on Thursday, when we look at science, because of course Eisenstein gives us this connection, that we go from print, and from print comes science. So there's two readings and an interview, an Anderson Cooper interview that I'd like you to look at by then. The first comes with a long note, and it's just a caution that Spratt is again one of our eyewitnesses to history. He was there when the Royal Society, the first British Society of Science, was founded, and very soon after, he writes this history of it. Now, I've asked you to look at just a small section of that. Just as you read it, assess his claims, and ask yourself, how much does this look like contemporary science? And how much is it really weird and different, and as different as Plato's account of written communication is? Because I think there are some ways in which it's a very prescient piece, getting exactly what science needs, but it's also problematic. Against that, two other things I'd like you to look at. One is an essay against quacks. And that gets at this question of, on the one hand, we have reliable scientific texts, and on the other hand, we have these things like almanacs, which seem to be peddling good advice, but in fact, they're trying to sell us something. And in fact, just at the time that the Royal Society was developing, here we have The Spectator, it was a magazine of its day, making exactly that argument, that there are just quacks everywhere, and their writings can be found. So we're again looking at two sides of the case here. Well, yes, printing is wonderful for the advancement of science. Well, no, printing is dreadful because it gets in the way. I'm going to look in particular, just as one part of scientific development worth exploring, at medicine. So I've asked you to look at an Anderson Cooper interview, which is about the question of whether certain vaccinations are reliable or in fact bad. And I want to look at that scientific debate, it's only a 5-minute interview or so, 10-minute interview, and cast that back again on the sort of claims that Spratt and that The Spectator are making. Okay, any questions? All right, thanks very much.